Welcome to Carnegie Political Podcast. My name is Alex Gabuev. I'm director of Carnegie Berlin Russia Eurasia Center and the host. The war in Ukraine is nearly at its 3-year mark, and we are seeing a period of escalation in the interregnum between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. The sounds of some kind of peace talks to resolve this horrible war are in the air. Trump's chief Ukraine advisor, General Kalak, has just outlined some of the bits and bytes of how Team Trump might see the end of this war. But actually, we are living through 2 very volatile months that I would call a period of escalation in this war. We've seen for the first time deep strikes into Russian territory by NATO-provided weapons with huge involvement of Western specialists. And we are also seeing Russia testing some of its strategic weapons in Ukraine. So to help me and you, dear listeners, understand and unpack that dynamics, I'm joined today by my colleague, James Acton, who is co-director of Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. You are very welcome, James.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Let me start in trying to assess where we are in this war in terms of escalation of risks. I think that I don't remember a situation like that where indeed the White House, after a very long hesitation, has provided Kyiv with ability to strike deep inside Russia with Western provided missiles, be it ATACMS, be it British Storm Shadow. We all know that Western military specialists are deeply involved in those strikes, and Putin is very open about that. That's a situation we haven't seen in the Cold War. And Russia, in response, is signaling its red lines. It's changing the language of its nuclear doctrine. It's testing new weapons in Ukraine. To me, that's very close to the nuclear scare of fall 2022, when Russia was in retreat, Ukrainians were about to liberate Kherson, and the U.S. intelligence community picked up the information that Russians might be contemplating to use nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And there was a series of measures in crisis diplomacy, and this crisis was dissipating and the war was going back into the conventional form. So where are we and why are we here?
Sure. So I think there's lots of reasons to be pessimistic about the direction of the war right now, at least from a Ukrainian perspective. But actually, I'm not particularly worried about escalation right now, or at least further escalation. I would fully agree with your analysis that we've seen escalation so far recently in the forms of the deep strikes into Russia with NATO-provided territory, then the Russian use of something that's a bit like an ICBM into Ukraine. But I'm actually not terribly worried right now about the possibility of further escalation, let alone the use of nuclear weapons. And I'm somebody who's been pretty pessimistic at times in this war. The reason why I'm not so pessimistic is because right now Putin's got what he wants, which is a US president coming into office in January who's almost certainly going to be a lot more amenable to Putin's aims and desires. And I just don't see why Putin would choose to, beyond this very symbolic escalation, this largely symbolic use of the new missile, I just don't see what particular reason Putin has to escalate. I mean, the worst case for Putin right now, in my opinion, the worst case from his perspective is that the US ceases to provide additional aid to Ukraine and the war rumbles on against a weakened Ukraine. The best case from his perspective is under huge amounts of US pressure, Ukraine cuts a peace deal that's very favorable to Putin and the war ends. So, right now, I think Putin has to be fairly optimistic about where he is. I think that's incidentally large part of the reason why Biden decided to give Ukraine authorization to use ATACMS deep within Russia, is because it was very clear Russia would have no particular reason to seriously escalate in response. So as I say, I'm just not that worried about the possibility of further escalation right now. I'm very pessimistic about the perspective of the war from Ukraine right now, but I just don't see Putin having any particular incentive now to escalate this or have any possibility of nuclear use.
I think I agree with you in terms of nuclear weapons in this war has been the ultimate insurance for Putin against defeat. When people say like, oh, he will never use that. But how do you know? I think that back in fall 2022, the situation he might be entering, thanks to his own procrastination in late mobilization, that this ill-equipped, ill-trained troops started to arrive to the front lines where Ukrainians were storming into various directions and were able to fetch Crimea, and the risk of collapse, cascading collapse of the Russian lines was real, well, you have this ultimate assurance. Whether you will use it or not is a 50-50 in the US intelligence assessment we know from reading the media. Now, I totally agree with you. We're very far away from this kind of tree of outcomes. It's far more beneficial. But here's the thing. From the Russian perspective, what's happening with this permission on the long-range strikes points to a very serious problem, that Russia's own deterrence is actually not working. If anybody would tell me back in February 22 that, Sasha, in 18 months, the Brits will strike the proud headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol with their own missiles, the Russians will know that Brits are heavily involved in that they got US authorization, Russian sailors will die, and yet World War III will not start. I would say, oh, you need to get your head examined. Like, that's definitely what's going to happen. And yet, we lived through this moment, and now, de facto, the White House managed to convince Vladimir Putin that strikes in the stolen territory of Ukraine are okay. That's not really Russia. So you've been pushed that far, and now the boundary is crossed again. And the Americans are striking into the internationally recognized territory of Russia, which something that never happened during the Cold War. So don't you think that this might lead us, like not the situation on the battlefield itself, but the Russian desire to reestablish deterrence might lead us into some unexpected escalatory dynamics and some very dangerous accidents?
So it's possible. Let's look back and let's look forward. Looking back, I think I fully agree. I was deeply concerned in fall 22 about the possibility, exactly as you said, that Crimea becomes, it looks like the Ukrainians may be able to take back Crimea. Russia's facing a catastrophic conventional defeat. You know, whether the odds were 50-50, I think there was a realistic chance of Russian nuclear use in that situation. A large part of what the West has very successfully done, and this is where I think the Biden administration deserves significant credit, is the West has successfully salami sliced Russia. Had the full scale of aid been provided on day one of this war, everything West has provided up to date being provided on day one, I think we could easily have been facing a nuclear war at that point. But the West has done very skillfully is to ramp up aid gradually and slowly in a way that Russia was never presented with a clear line at which point it could say this far and no further. And you know, people have argued that because Russia didn't escalate, we could have provided aid a lot more quickly, but that ignores the reality that Russia may not have escalated because we didn't provide aid so quickly, because there was never a kind of clear break point at which it became sensible for Russia to escalate in some dramatic and dangerous way. Looking forward, I would fully agree with you that Russia may think it has a problem on its hands. I still think deterrence is held in this war in two very, very important respects. The United States and NATO have not sent combat forces into this war. I would draw a distinction, and I suspect Putin does too, between specialists assisting Ukraine to fire missiles into Russia and actual engagement of Western troops in this war. And meanwhile, Russia has not attacked NATO supply lines in NATO territory. That would be a legitimate military target, but Russia hasn't done it. So, you know, I think deterrence has held in important respects in this war. I'm sure you're right that as the Russians look at it, though, they worry that deterrence is failing in important ways. And maybe that gives them an incentive to do some kind of dramatic escalation. I think that's what the Oreshnik missile was, this new missile that the Russians have developed. That was Putin's way of doing something, using something like an intercontinental ballistic missile that has never been used in warfare before, as a way of kind of dramatically signaling that one of Russia's red lines has been crossed. The fact that it was just one of them, the fact that we haven't seen very much in the way of follow-up, the fact that Putin has not been making very much in the way of threats, all of this suggests to me that right now, Putin wants to just get through to Trump, as in get through until Trump becomes president, and then stuff looks a lot more favorable for Russia. You know, Russia has signaled in its new nuclear doctrine, I'm sure we'll discuss this further, that it's somewhat lowered the threshold for nuclear use. Is it possible post-war that Russia may take some kind of dramatic action, resume nuclear testing, like something like that? Sure, I think that's possible as a way of kind of trying to re-up the potency of Russia's nuclear deterrent. So I don't want to give you the impression that I'm sanguine about the overall state of US-Russia relations or where we're going in the future or escalation risks in general. I just can't see. I think it is very unlikely, though, that Russia will further escalate in dramatic ways between now and Trump's inauguration.
I think that you mentioned the nuclear doctrine, and people in the Kremlin and in the Russian government, at least some people we speak to, have put a lot of hope that, changing the official document and lowering the threshold, saying that it will be not only a nuclear attack, but a conventional attack, and a conventional attack by non-nuclear state, meaning Ukraine, aided by a nuclear state. So if France helps Ukraine with its drones and it's a massive attack, then Russia might consider employment. And all of these new formulas are as vague as in previous one. So it's somewhat lowered and inflated threshold, but there is no automatic reaction that Russia will react. Ukraine has sent more than 100 drones into Russia. It's occupying part of sovereign Russia territory around Kursk for fourth month now, and nuclear use is still not possible. But nevertheless, how serious is that change, and how serious people are looking at that in Washington, D.C.?
Let's talk about what the change is to start with. Russia did not have a no first use doctrine previously, right? Russia didn't say we would only use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack. The basic Russian threshold for the use of nuclear weapons previously was a threat to the existence of the state, which was an ill-defined and vague concept, right? Is the loss of Crimea a threat to the existence of the state? Well, if Russia says it is, then it is. Now the threshold has been lowered to threats to the sovereignty of the state, which is somewhat lower and more ambiguous. There is this specific language that if a non-nuclear state attacks Russia in cooperation with a nuclear state, that nukes are on the table. And, this idea of a massive conventional attack. It's not an independent condition of a threat to sovereignty. It's an example of what may threaten Russian sovereignty. A few points. Firstly, no country's doctrine ever says we will use nuclear weapons in this circumstance. It's always we hold open the option of using nuclear weapons, or we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons, something like that. Secondly, the fundamental challenge here that Russia faces is there's a difference. You can say what you want. The question is whether the other side views it as being credible. You can say that if somebody takes 1 millimeter of our territory, we will use nuclear weapons, and very few people think that would be a terribly credible threat. So making a threat doesn't automatically make it credible. And that's the problem that Russia faces, and it's the problem that every country with nuclear weapons faces. At what point does it become genuinely credible to threaten nuclear weapons? Now, publicly, the US government has given a bit of a yawn to the doctrine, which is like a perfectly sensible reaction. You never want to appear to be worried by what the other side is saying. And I think, interestingly, I was expecting bigger changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine than we actually saw. I mean, there was some kind of track 2 type signaling going on that we were going to see some pretty dramatic stuff in Russia's nuclear doctrine, and none of that stuff transpired. What I would say is Russia's nuclear doctrine is studied extremely carefully in Washington. A lot of folks, rightly in my opinion, worry about the possibility of Russian nuclear use. But I do think that's based more on an assessment of which particular actions would threaten Putin to the point that it could appear to him that the use of nuclear weapons would be less bad than not using them, as opposed to the stated conditions in Russian doctrine. And those doctrines kind of give you some general vague sense of what people around Putin, maybe Putin himself thinks those triggers might be. But I would say, my impression from talking to government officials over many years is it's much more an intelligence assessment of what actions would threaten Russia, as opposed to the stated conditions on paper. To be clear, I think the US has been pretty cautious in supplying weapons to Russia throughout this war. There's still a lot further that Biden could go, but is clearly not going to go in the next couple of months. I don't necessarily myself view Russia's threats as being incredible, impossible, anything like that. I just think threatening to use nuclear weapons because somebody flies through a few drones at you is not that credible. Threatening the use of nuclear weapons if you're faced with a full-scale invasion is totally credible. Where between those two extremes you draw the line is a really tough thing.
Beyond changing the doctrine, which is all about wars, Russia has demonstrated some deeds, and that this strike on Dnipro with this new missile, Oreshnik. I know that still, like, the debris is studied by Ukrainians and most likely their allies. There is still a lot of stuff that we don't know. There is a lot of stuff that's classified. But let's try to unpack what we know for now and what that means. To me, watching the videos, and I'm not a specialist, so just take it as a dilettante take, I was like, interesting that there is so little explosion. And like, are these warheads loaded at all? And now we see that in the press that most likely it were just dummies and not conventionally loaded warheads. So it's a signal that you have something new, that it's difficult to intercept at this point. And in theory, you can launch that. So how would you read that use and like what is actually that is important here?
What we know is that Russia launched some new kind of ballistic missile, a very high-speed, long-range ballistic missile. We're talking a minute about how to classify it at Ukraine. We saw from the footage that there were multiple separate re-entry vehicles, multiple separate warheads come down, each one of which appears to split into multiple separate warheads. But as you say, there was no explosion. These things don't appear to have been loaded with conventional explosives. But I would not necessarily call them as dummies. The speed at which that kind of ballistic missile re-enters, something without high explosives can cause a tremendous amount of damage if it's sufficiently accurate. Now, I have no idea how accurate this thing was. There's really two possibilities. One is this was like a strike that was purely for show. You know, these were not massively accurate warheads. They were not loaded with high explosives. This was just a statement of using this new kind of missile type. The other possibility is this is much more of a real weapons system that is designed to be superbly accurate and therefore doesn't need high explosives because it just destroys stuff via the speed. I have no idea which one of those two is correct. You know, if you forced me to say, I would probably lean towards the first interpretation, but like, I don't know, and I want to make it very clear I don't know. You know, let's go back in time a bit to Russia's while the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, was still in effect. Russia was developing a new missile at that point, which was somewhat ambiguous as to whether it was an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, or an IRBM, an intermediate range ballistic missile. ICBMs were not prohibited by the treaty. IRBMs were prohibited by the treaty. And the definition in the treaty is the longest range to which something had been tested. This is for a ballistic missile, not for a cruise missile. So if this new missile, the RS-26, had been tested to more than 5,500 kilometers, it was a ICBM and not prohibited by the treaty. If it had been tested to less than 5,500 kilometers, it was an IRBM and was prohibited by the treaty. Now, Russia tested this thing to just over 5,500 kilometers. Almost certainly by taking out a load of weight, it wasn't armed. It was a way of testing it just beyond the limit of the treaty. So both Russia and the US could say legally, no, this was not an IRBM. It's not prohibited by the treaty. Many people looking at the debris, looking at the analysis, I don't have an independent view on this, but a lot of people in the US, I trust, think Oreshnik was that missile. And that would have a certain amount of symbolism to it because an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, has never been used in conflict before. And moreover, ICBMs have historically always been exclusively nuclear armed. So the use of something the US considers to be an ICBM in Ukraine would be a politically significant act. It would be the first use of an ICBM in combat. It would be the use of a system that was like nuclear adjacent. It potentially satisfies Russia's demand for doing something in response to the ATACMS strikes in the US that was dramatic and significant and unprecedented, but ultimately just for show. Russia has denied that the Oreshnik is derived from a previous missile. I know a lot of people I trust who are pretty skeptical on that. It would make a lot of sense from a symbolism perspective if this new missile was indeed derived from that previous missile.
And then if that doesn't impress people, well, people take it seriously, but we don't see any change of US policy after that. The Russian ministry has reported that there have been ATACMS strikes after Oreshnik use in Kursk and neighboring regions. And probably the Ukrainians, with massive help of NATO, are preparing some other strikes. So what will get the attention to actually change this policy? Or people perceive that, okay, it's limited, it's conventional. You Russians know that Ukrainians don't have too many of that missiles. That actually doesn't change the war trajectory. It puts Ukrainian into a somewhat better position on the battlefield, but you are not losing this war. So you don't need to escalate further and, I don't know, attack a Western embassy in Kiev or strike the border crossing between Poland and Ukraine where this military aid flows and land a couple of missiles into Polish territory, well, accidentally, as Russians would claim. So you don't need to go into that territory.
That's my view. Let's be clear. If Russia wanted to escalate in order to try to scare, in order to try to coerce, compel NATO into withdrawing permissions for the ATACMS strike deep into Russia, it could have options to do that, right? You named some of them. Attack a Western embassy, attack a border crossing, attack supply lines within NATO. There's a bunch of stuff the Russians could do to raise the risk of escalation. That may or may not be successful. That's the kind of action that could trigger that could, on the one hand, succeed in coercing NATO into privately at least telling Ukraine to stop it with the ATACMS strikes. Or it could lead NATO to escalate in response, right? That would be a risky strategy. That would be what we term brinkmanship. I would be pretty worried about Russia engaging in brinkmanship and raising the risk of escalation if, say, Kamala Harris had won the election. Because I think from the Russian perspective, a Harris administration would look like the continuation of a Biden administration. They would expect similar policies and maybe additional military aid, further escalation on the part of the West. And in that case, I think there would be a pretty strong incentive for Russia to heavily escalate in some more than symbolic way in response to the ATACMS strikes. Again, with Trump coming in, I just don't see Russia having that incentive. The end of the day, as I say, the worst case for Russia right now, I think the reasonable worst case is the war rumbles on, but with Ukraine's having much less aid from the West and no further aid from the United States. So I just don't think it's in Russia's interest to start playing brinkmanship at this point.
I've seen some commentary in Russia that compares the current use of Oreshnik and NATO's plans to bring long-range capabilities into Germany that was pledged around the NATO summit in Washington, that, it's somewhat similar to the European missile crisis in the 80s, and that might actually reach a threshold where both sides want to negotiate, and that's how we got to INF treaty. So when the war is over and there is a ceasefire that can hold, then the talking about the INF moratorium of positioning the systems in European theater by both NATO and Russia and something like that, the pathway for this would open. What's your view?
I think the technical term for that is hopium. The INF analogy is a very attractive one to grasp for right now, but I think it's very, very important differences. I mean, to remind listeners, back in the early 80s, Russia had deployed I don't remember if it was medium or intermediate range, but the SS-20, like it was a regional missile for use against Europe. The NATO, against a lot of internal friction, then deployed the Gryphon ground-launched cruise missile and the Pershing II ballistic missile. And then the US and NATO and Russia negotiated all of those systems away and had the INF treaty, which prohibited all ground-launched cruise and ballistic missiles with ranges from 500 to 5,500 kilometers. The big difference of what was going on there and now is there was internal political change within the Soviet Union. In the middle of the Euro missiles crisis, the Soviet Union goes through its multiple leaders over the course of a year, 18 months. Gorbachev, who was not seeking to break apart the Soviet Union, but reform the system and save money and allow the Soviets to, compete a bit more effectively, the INF Treaty is pretty important to him. Reagan clearly has a major change of heart as well, and changes his personal assessment of the Soviet Union, and the INF Treaty happens. Now, there's various complications today. One is I don't see much prospect for internal political change in Russia today. I guess I wouldn't totally preclude the possibility of, after the war, Trump and Putin engaging in some kind of negotiation. Putin has made an offer to negotiate a moratorium on the deployment of INF-type missiles into Europe. I wouldn't regard it as impossible that some discussions on that after the war start. And I've always thought it was a reasonable thing to negotiate over. But I was always pretty skeptical of getting an agreement that actually made sense for NATO and for the United States. Things like verification of that are just very, very difficult. I was always skeptical that the offer was made in good faith, which one has to actually do a negotiation to test whether it was made in good faith. Now, again, maybe Trump withdraws from NATO de facto or de jure, and at that point, is willing to do a deal with Putin and massively override European objections. But from Russia's perspective, if Poland has long-range strike capabilities of its own, or if it acquires them from somebody, an agreement with the US starts to make a lot less sense. And then you have China in all of this, because the US clearly wants medium or intermediate range missiles in Asia to deal with China, but they can also reach Russian territory. And I think, when you start digging down into all of the complications, it's very hard for me to see how you get an agreement out of that. So again, for all of those reasons, I don't think the current missile, I'm trying to think of the right word for it, competition, race, whatever you want to call it, in Europe is going to be resolved in the same way as the INF Treaty was, as the original Euro missiles crisis was. I don't think it's going to be resolved.
Okay, last question, and then we go to one more level of what you use the technical term hopium, is the arms control agreements around the strategic missiles. We have the START treaty that was signed during the Obama era with President Medvedev. I was working as a Kremlin reporter at that time, and that was the major achievement of the reset. Was really a big contribution by Moscow and Washington, D.C. into global and regional stability. The ability to renew this treaty and to extend it for another 5 years was celebrated as one of the major achievements of Biden's Russia policy in 2021, well before Russia invaded Ukraine. And then the talks on how to arrive at a new treaty that would include various parts of what the Russians call strategic equation. So all of the advancement of new technology, nuclear and non-nuclear, into a more comprehensive deal. So hope for that is gone. Do you think that it's possible that we're going to see at least an extension of START or an interest to negotiate an actually new deal under Trump?
The first thing to say is legally within the United States, you cannot extend New START. The treaty was for 10 years and allowed for an extension of up to 5 years. But legally, for the US to extend New START, the entire treaty would have to be resubmitted to the Senate as a treaty, and it would have to be ratified from scratch again. I've been very pessimistic about the future of arms control. I still thought New START made a lot of sense for the US and Russia. There was, going into history here, Russia has been violating the treaty. Not the central limits, which Russia still appears to be compliant with, but Russia's refusal to allow inspections after the end of COVID was a flat-out violation of the treaty. So the treaty is each side has said it will abide by the central limits of the treaty, the key numerical limits. But the treaty is functionally mostly dead at this point anyway, and will definitely expire in February 26. Again, I wouldn't totally preclude the possibility of the US and Russia engaging in some kind of discussions over what will succeed, over whether anything should succeed New START. There were discussions over the extension of New START in the first Trump administration. it was marked by an extraordinary level of unseriousness on the US part, coming up with proposals that it claimed it could verify and it simply couldn't, and it's not worth digging into the details here. But suffice to say, it was very much for show rather than substance. And one could imagine Trump wanting to pursue negotiations with Russia for a similar kind of reason in the second administration. He likes the idea of negotiating with Russia. He's clearly got a man crush on Putin. You can see there are reasons why Trump may want to negotiate with Russia. There's questions about whether you could get any kind of a deal. Russia has lots of demands related ballistic missile defense and this, that, and the other, and the US has demands with non-strategic nuclear weapons. Historically, each side before previous negotiations has insisted on, you've got to consider A, B, C, and D, and then each side drops its leverage and you just end up negotiating over strategic offensive weapons, and one could imagine that happening again. I think given the unseriousness of the first Trump administration on these issues, I wouldn't preclude the possibility of some kind of deal. One could imagine a non-legally binding extension of the central limits for some number of years. But even that, I have to say, I think is pretty unlikely, in no small part because the US is very worried about China and the US wants to expand to deal with China. Russia's never going to settle for anything with parity. Anything other than parity, but US-Russia parity doesn't help the US, in the Pentagon's view, deal with China. So I wouldn't preclude the possibility of a deal for show, but I think it's pretty unlikely, I have to say.
Well, James, I need to confess that you made me somewhat more optimistic than I was when entering into this conversation, because if you, one of the most clear-eyed and preeminent nuclear experts out there, think that the risk of escalation is actually low and we are in a bad territory, but not the horrible territory, and it's much better than it was in fall 2022, I can sleep much tighter. Thank you so much, James, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.